We're going to get together, going to have a great panel, talk about student feedback literacy. I'm being asked if the mic is on. The mic is all good, yeah? Yeah. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And we thank them for allowing us to have this event here today on their land, and we acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty has not been ceded. So, feedback literacy. Let's just jump a little bit back to the term feedback first, because it's a somewhat contentious thing. If you want to look up a blog post I wrote a little while back about how to start an argument with feedback, well, we've got some of the people that argument was with here today. There have been huge efforts to improve feedback over the past 10 to 15 years. However, it remains one of the most hotly contested areas of higher education research, and also an area of great student dissatisfaction. A lot of students are still telling us they're not satisfied with feedback. On the educator end, we have this experience of students not accessing feedback, not using it, having conflict around feedback. Feedback from the student perspective is problematic. It's problematic from the educator perspective. It's the source of a lot of our lost weekends, the provision of feedback that ultimately may not be collected or used. This is a great big problem. In recent years, feedback researchers have tried to shift from a focus on feedback information, so how can I provide really high quality comments to students, to also focusing on feedback processes. A feedback processes view of feedback, well, it's just all about what does the student actually do with feedback, and how can we design really great circumstances that are going to enable students to make best use of feedback. This requires a lot of students because it means they need to be able to seek out, understand and make use of feedback and make productive use of their emotions through that process. And that's led some people on the panel to propose feedback literacy, which is, to put it simply, how can I get feedback and use it and not be as hurt by it as I have been in the past? And I don't know about you, but that's a struggle that I still face. So I can say that we have expertise in the room, but I personally, while maybe having some expertise in feedback literacy, still find it a real struggle on a personal level. We've got a panel here today because we've been holding an international symposium on feedback literacy, where we've got some great experts, some of whom are on the panel, some of whom are in the room with me today, and we've been trying to advance the idea of feedback literacy from a range of different perspectives and disciplines and countries. It's really exciting. I'm going to introduce you to the panel now, and then after that, the panel's going to have a chance to just give a bit of a summary of their work on feedback literacy and where things have come from. So on the panel, from my right, your left, to the other side, we have David Carlis from the University of Hong Kong. We have David Bowd from Cradle at Deakin. We have Elizabeth Malloy from the University of Melbourne. We have Anastasia Lipnovich from the City University of New York, and we have Naomi Winston from Surrey University in the UK. So thank you all for coming and joining us. I'm going to hand over to David Carlis now, who's going to start us off. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and great to see you all here and online. As Phil has just indicated, there is a kind of collective disillusionment with feedback. The teachers are spending a lot of time marking, providing feedback, but they're worried about whether it's of any use. The students are tending to feel that feedback is too little, too late, not detailed enough, not coming at the right time when they can use it. So this is a problem that we've grappled with for some time now. And the members of this panel, I believe, have an idea that feedback literacy could be part of a solution to these problems. I like to think of feedback literacy as representing know-how about how to do feedback effectively. Feedback needs to be a partnership. It needs to bring in both the teachers and the students working in partnership to try and make feedback processes useful. So in terms of the teacher know-how, I think we see it principally as designing feedback effectively so that students have the opportunities to use it. Feedback is only making a difference, it's only having an impact if it can be used. So a clear teacher role are the design factors, the setting up of opportunities for students to use feedback. Then the student role is very much to run with this feedback, to use it, to put it into action. So feedback literacy is the know-how for each of these two key parties to make the most of the feedback opportunities. The teacher in terms of design, the student in terms of use and uptake. So that's a kind of starting point. Feedback literacy is the know-how to make the most of feedback. And then on my left, our good friend, the #1 higher education researcher in the world, he and I, we wrote a paper on student feedback literacy, and we prepared or proposed a framework of 4 interlocking components to argue or suggest what feedback literacy was. So the first box was appreciating feedback, that students need to see the value of feedback, to see what's in it for them, to get experience of using feedback, so seeing it as a positive process. The second box was making judgments. This follows a long line of argumentation around self-assessment, evaluative judgment, self-regulated learning, that students need to be able to make increasingly sophisticated judgments of their work in progress so they can adjust it during its production, so that they are self-monitoring before the submission. That was the second box. The third one, Phil's referred to this tricky issue of managing affect, the balance between critical and encouraging feedback and the willpower and the sort of skills and dispositions to take the difficult feedback on the chin, but to regroup and to make use of it, something that is quite a difficult skill. And these ideas were all converging on taking action. So appreciating feedback, making judgments, managing affect for the purpose of action or uptake of feedback, because I think that's been an argument that many of us have been making over the last 10 or 15 years, that we need to design for impact. So that's a little opening statement from me, and I will hand over to Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think our work and further work on feedback literacy has been prompted by this big shift of thinking about feedback. Traditionally, feedback is what we as teachers and educators do to and for students, and that means that we're accountable for everything, right? If anything goes wrong, it's down to us. Towards a view of feedback as being a process in which there's joint responsibility between us and the student. But the problem is the students don't know often what they can do. They see feedback as a mysterious process that is done to them, and they don't see themselves as inhabiting the problem. And the problem isn't the information that we provide to them. The problem is their learning and the improvement of their work. And a part of what we're doing in this focus on student feedback literacy is to kind of mobilise students to think in terms of themselves as active learners, so that there are things that they can do with the very helpful inputs they get from us, from their peers, from whoever it is that is providing things which they can deploy for themselves for their own ends. So a part of student feedback literacy is a part of mobilising students to be active anyway. And it fits alongside the shift from student passivity, sit there, suck it up, towards student learning. And we know that learning is a process whereby students have to do things themselves, that you can't learn by sitting here. You can only learn by engaging with materials, objects, ideas, models, whatever. So that's a part of where we're going. So David and I worked on that initial paper about feedback literacy and started to try to conceptualise it. But we're also part of an OLT project. There's a joint project between Monash and Deakin. And as part of that project, we and a whole lot of other people in the room here were engaged in discussions about what feedback is, how do we do it. And from that, we started to ask ourselves the question, can we get some evidence from students about what might be needed in a framework, a way of thinking about the development of students' feedback literacy that can help start us along the journey of working out how to accommodate that within the normal curriculum. So unless we know what it is, unless students know what it is, unless they've developed the capabilities not only to know about feedback, but to utilise it in their own work, then we can't go any further. So that led to an unpacking of those initial categories, but also then referring back to the student data we had from that work across Monash and Deakin to actually flesh that out. And that, in a sense, leads to Liz and her, the second of our two feedback literacy papers.
Yep. Okay, so when we started talking about notions of student feedback literacy, we thought we can't ask students about feedback literacy because they'd run a mile, and B, they probably don't know what we're talking about. And I suspect they would still run a mile if we started using terms like feedback literacy. So to mine this concept, what we thought about was, let's ask the students, when did feedback work for you? In other words, when did feedback make a difference to your learning or your performance? And we had surveys of about 4,500 students. We also had 5 focus groups and about 28 in-depth interviews with the students. And we mined that qualitative data using thematic analysis and being sensitised by the framework that Dave and Dave had published. And essentially what came out of that is 7 groupings, and we had 31 items of what we think represent a feedback literate student. So as Dave said yesterday, if you bumped into a feedback literate student, this is what they might look like and what they might do. So those categories that we came up with was a feedback literate student would commit to feedback as improvement, they'd appreciate feedback as an active process, they elicit information to improve learning, they process feedback information, they acknowledge and work with emotion, and we thought this was slightly different. What they were talking about in the data was slightly different to managing emotion, which tends to be pull your socks up and punch through it. This was more about actually identifying the role of emotions and the potential mobilising role of emotions in the process. Acknowledging feedback as a reciprocal process and that notion of generating feedback and how that has an impact also. And then finally, that action, that enacting the outcomes of this processing in order to produce better work. So, I think what is exciting about this framework, hopefully it gives us more clarity about what constitutes feedback know-how from the student's perspective. And with more clarity about what it looks like, then hopefully some of our educational designs and activities will help people to get there. So we don't think it's exhaustive. Like any sort of thematic analysis, we've put these themes into buckets, and these might not hold stable over time, but it is a starting point in the conversation. We were fortunate to do at a similar time, we did a parallel study in the healthcare environment, which is where I do most of my research. And we looked at trying to develop students' feedback literacy at the classroom, the interface between the classroom and the workplace. So we had students from medicine, nursing and allied health. They were second year, they were about to plunge into clinical placements, and we had online priming activities about feedback. We had an immersive workshop, so they role-played feedback, and we talked about the sort of activities they might have in the workplace and the sort of people in the workplace that might provide useful information to them that would help them improve their work. So we did that, then they launched into their placements, and 3 months after that intervention, we then interviewed them. So we had one-on-one in-depth interviews, and we asked them, what could you put into practice? What couldn't you put into practice? Who couldn't you access and why? And so in a way, that data helped us to conceptualise what feedback literacy might look like for a learner in the workplace. And we published that this year in Advances in Health Sciences Education. A couple of things that really, the data illuminated a few things for us, and one was just how much work we have to do in the classroom curriculum to improve people's feedback literacy. So students said they found it a great surprise that they could hunt down feedback information. They really thought that they should be on the ropes and wait for it to be delivered by a knowledgeable other. And so I think that has implications for when we should start these conversations and also these authentic activities to help students build these capacities early, so there's not this sharp inflection point when they jump into workplace learning. The second thing that was really strong, and it reflects, I think, what we've experienced as educators when we're working with educators about this broader notion of feedback, is that students said, asking an educator to watch for something particular in my practice was the biggest thing that made a difference to the utility of that feedback information that came in. So just, low-hanging fruit, but I think that conversation did help migrate their practice. So there are two empirical studies. One was in the higher ed context, the other one was in the healthcare context, and starting to boil up some ideas about what this thing might look like, but also some ideas about, from a pedagogical point of view, what we might do with design to try to help students build these capacities.
I'm very happy to be here, first of all. And I must go back to the title of this event. I remember the first time when Phil sent me an invitation to this panel, I read the actual title of this event, which has landscapes and horizons of feedback literacy, right? So very poetic, Joe and Phil. And it immediately evoked my favorite paintings, favorite landscapes. And unfortunately, we were not allowed to have PowerPoints, otherwise I would be showing you beautiful works of art. But I would like for you to work with me and kind of imagine, kind of envision some of these paintings. So imagine a Monet, your favorite Monet, something from Impressionist, a landscape, okay? Then maybe Hieronymus Bosch, right? So he's this dark, he used to paint landscapes of hell. Then a surrealist Spaniard, Dali, okay? Then we have Kandinsky, something from Expressionists. So all of those landscapes are stunning, very beautiful, but they're very, very different, right? So when we started this conversation about feedback literacy, that's what it felt like to me, that we're all painting our own landscape, and each of us has that landscape that has a certain appeal, is very interesting, has certain audience, but they're very, very different. And because I come from the measurement perspective, so I'm an educational psychologist with background in assessment and measurement in a kind of psychometric kind of sense, to me, to arrive at the point when we as scientists would be painting at least the same thing, all right, same kind of landscape, we would need to really carefully operationalize this concept, this idea, this construct, whatever you want to call it, of feedback literacy, and then assess it, assess every component, kind of break it down into observable behaviors or well-defined characteristics, and then we would be able to say, okay, so you are low on these dispositions, you are high on emotion management, so let's design interventions that would help you, improve your feedback literacy. So that, to me, would bring us as a field towards that kind of similar landscape, because although scientists are frequently compared to artists, or maybe they're not, maybe that's what I do, not very humbly, right? But I think because we are scientists and we possess these scientific tools, I think it's our responsibility to at least have a kind of similar language to kind of define this space for conversation and feedback literacy. And I think over the past day and a half, we're kind of getting there.
Okay, so I'm going to start by returning to something that Dave said, which was the term responsibility sharing and sharing responsibility in feedback processes. we often pass the buck, I think, when we're looking at the reasons why feedback processes may not be working in the way that we hope. And I'll illustrate this with paraphrasing two quotes from participants in some research that we did. One of these participants is a student, and they said, "It's not my responsibility to use feedback because I'm paying for it," which is a slightly worrying logic in there somewhere. So contrast that with an academic who, in response to a question about what he did to support students to use feedback and get the most out of feedback, he said, "I don't do anything and I won't do anything. If students do not know how to use feedback effectively, they should not be at university." And I think this illustrates a real problem with whose fault is this? And how can we then move forward in making feedback processes more effective? We should not make an assumption that students come to higher education fully formed with the skills and capacities to use feedback effectively. Now, they may have developed some very good strategies in the school context, but the higher education context is very, very different. I would also echo Phil in saying that I don't think I've fully learned how to use feedback to the most effect, because it's different in every context where you encounter feedback. So firstly, I don't think we should make any assumptions that students will know how to use feedback or they shouldn't be at university. There's something that we should be looking at doing within higher education to empower students to make the most out of feedback, not just while they're in university, but throughout their working lives and in their personal lives as well. So that notion of sharing responsibility, I think, is incredibly important. And students have a responsibility to be proactive in seeking and using feedback and getting the most out of those experiences. But where I think our primary responsibility rests as educators is not in giving lots and lots of feedback. That's a transmission view of feedback. But where our responsibility lies is in providing students with the opportunity to develop the skills that really support effective use of feedback, and to design assessments in ways that facilitate students' use of feedback. So that context is important too. If we're going to be developing these capacities in our students, we need to think about the difference between bolt-on or additional sessions versus embedding these into the very fundamental nature of what we teach to students, how we work with students, and the opportunities we give them to evidence their learning and their development. And we know from a variety of studies that the bolt-on additional sessions that may look at the skills around feedback are not as effective as things that are embedded into the curriculum. The way in which we talk about a discipline, the way in which a student develops an identity as studying that discipline, and the kinds of assessment activities that we encourage students to undertake whilst they're with us in higher education. One final point that I will leave with at this point is that skills are only one part of the process. I think a really fundamental part of being able to use feedback well and to be feedback literate is confidence and feeling that we are capable of using feedback. And that comes from having opportunities to try that out and to hone those skills over time. It's not something we can do in a one-off setting and say, we will give you this intervention, you are now feedback literate. If that were the case, I would not be feedback literate at all, because it's always ongoing and it's always changing.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panel for kicking this all off. I was watching the YouTube stream just then and I saw a really interesting couple of questions around, is this just a higher ed thing? We've had Liz mention it as a healthcare workplace thing. But is this something for schools as well? Anyone like to pick us up?
Well, I can
speak
to that slightly, because the resources that we developed for use in higher education, we were then approached by some schools in the UK to take these into that kind of setting. And what was interesting was that the adaptation of these resources was really not very different. The challenges, the strategies were very similar. And I think, therefore, it's something that we can think about building within students from a very early age. There's a practice in schools in the UK called DIRT time, Dedicated Improvement and Reflection Time. And it's starting to gain traction where teachers will use class time once students have completed some work and they've got some comments from their teacher to enact those comments immediately in class time and trying to develop some of those reflective capacities quite early on. So I don't think it is just a higher education thing.
David?
Not only can it be adapted for use in schools, I believe even more importantly, it's got great resonance for the workplace and for lifelong learning, that I think to be productive members of a community and to be lifelong learners, we need to be developing these capacities.
So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about development of feedback literacy in a somewhat abstract sense. I'm wondering if anyone could give me something more concrete, possibly, Naomi, some of the approaches that you might, perhaps some of the stuff in the DEFT toolkit?
Yeah, so I think the kinds of activities that we can do with students to develop feedback literacy are things that we might be doing anyway. What then turns them into an intervention in this sense is simply explaining to students why we're doing them and how these activities might be having an impact on their feedback literacy. So to give you a couple of examples, we did a systematic review of the literature in 2017 on student engagement with feedback. And in that, we reviewed a lot of the interventions that had already been published with the aim of improving students' engagement with feedback. And within that review, we included things like exemplars, giving students the opportunity to assess their work against an exemplar, to engage perhaps in peer review, peer feedback processes. Now, these are things that we might be doing anyway, but we can repurpose them, I suppose, as a feedback literacy intervention simply by explaining to students the rationale for why we're doing them and what impact we think they might have in terms of developing their feedback literacy. So I think there's a range of opportunities that we can embed within our programs for students to develop the capacity to make judgments, to help them understand and appreciate the varying purposes of feedback. I think the hardest one in terms of developing and thinking about how we develop is the emotional dimension, because it's very, very difficult, I think, to understand where a student's coming from and what their emotional challenges may be. In my own practice, what's been most effective has been sharing with students my own experiences with feedback, my own challenges, my weaknesses when engaging with feedback, and some of the journeys that I've been on in developing my own feedback literacy, being very open and honest and sharing that with students.
Dave, did you want to say something to this?
Yeah. I mean, one of the simplest things we can do to kind of start down the path of developing students' feedback literacy is just have expectations of students. So help form what students think feedback is. Expect and position our students to think that feedback is not something I'm giving to you. What is happening is the beginning of a process. So it's almost like we have to talk it into existence to shift students from the idea that feedback is something which unsolicited we kind of thrust on them, to the idea that our expectation is always that they do something with it. So, for example, we might ask students to say what would be most helpful in the comments we provide on their work. No extra work, no extra effort on our place, but it's starting the process of positioning students differently vis-a-vis the feedback process. So they don't start with feedback by getting something thrust on them. They start with feedback by being invited to say, as a learner, what it is that they would find most helpful. And similarly, when they receive information, we might then ask them, what are you going to do with it? And that, again, creates the expectation that we expect them to do something with it. It isn't just a kind of ritual we engage in after some assessment event.
Anna, did you want to?
Yes, and I, again, coming from the field of cognitive psychology, we know that we don't always know what's helpful and what's accurate. So I think it's also unfair and unrealistic to expect students to know what kind of feedback that they should be asking for. So it all relates to the level of expertise, to the level of prior knowledge, background knowledge that our students have. So if we think that our students possess enough background knowledge, that they are metacognitively sophisticated enough to ask for help, because in many cases, and I often reflect on situations like that when I take courses in domains in which I have zero expertise, I always realize that I have no idea how to ask for feedback because I simply do not possess background knowledge. So imagine a student who comes, who takes your class for the first time, maybe it's a first-year student. They would not know what to ask for, so we need to account for that as well.
And we need to help them make those first statements. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, Liz go for it.
Yeah, I was going to say one practical activity we introduced to our feedback literacy workshop for students in the healthcare environment was to talk about the role of peer feedback. So we gave the example of if you're a medical student and you have a peer medical student, that asking Dave, your peer, to watch you do a task and then to have feedback afterwards can be very useful. And we even had discussions about credibility judgments and that idea of Dave might not be able to comment on certain aspects of my performance because of his level of expertise, but he might be able to comment on the fact that I drew the curtains and that I was being respectful to the patient. And so what he's providing feedback on is actually really important, but it might be in a different domain to an expert that's been around the traps for 10 years. And so then we discussed that idea about the benefits of multi-source feedback and building a picture, like pixels of performance. The other thing about that reciprocity, I think, is that often people think that the person in the hot seat is the one that benefits from feedback. But if you're the watcher, this idea that by virtue of watching someone do a performance, you have to engage necessarily in what good work might look like in order to have that feedback discussion afterwards. So there's advantages for the watched as well as the watcher.
Thanks. I'm going to do one question from online now, and then we'll throw over to a question from the room. There's a question from, I think it was Jack Goodman on the YouTube stream, that we're using a lot of face-to-face talk in this conversation. And in Australia, a lot of education is online. Is this something that can work, can exist in the online space? I'm wondering, Anna, you've done a bit of online sort of feedback research lately. I wonder if any of that is relevant to this.
Unfortunately, the kind of work that we've conducted. So I did a share of studies in massive open online courses, and feedback does not work in that context the same way, simply because we have, again, going back to background knowledge and prior knowledge of learners, they all come in with their own baggage, so it's really hard to tailor feedback to all of them, so that it's helpful for them. So feedback in that setting becomes an instructional event. So basically you have to educate them. So feedback becomes a mini lecture in that sense. But in terms of scalability, I think it's quite scalable. So for example, we are now toying with the idea of using rubrics and exemplars, and I'm pointing at Ernesto Panadero here. So we've done a share of studies in which we tried to use non-individualized feedback. So we had students do work and then had them engage with rubrics and exemplars and force them, basically, nicely ask them, to self-assess and revise their work based on rubrics and exemplars. And then we get really good findings, and I can see how it can be used with 20 students and then 1,000 students equally well.
I might actually talk a little bit to this, because in the symposium we've had a bit of a conversation about feedback literacy in the online space, and there's been sort of this view that another set of feedback literacy capabilities might be required for interacting with some online communities. You can seek out feedback in the online world that will reinforce what you already believe. That's quite a danger, so there's a need for some real discernment around that. And there's also, I guess, a blurry line in some circumstances between feedback and cheating. And if you get someone to do substantive edits to your work, where is the line between that and cheating? I'm wondering if that has a role in feedback literacy, that sort of academic integrity component. We have thoughtful faces.
I suppose this relates to one of the other things we've been talking about within the symposium, which is where are the bounds of feedback literacy? Where does this just become the capacity to learn and to be an effective student? And I suppose when we start to look into those other areas that are pertinent to assessment, but maybe we don't think about in the frameworks or the existing frameworks of feedback literacy, it's bringing us back to that idea of where does feedback literacy end and learning begin? Where's that boundary?
I mean, I think by evoking the idea of feedback literacy, we're just focusing on a subset of learning how to learn. So I don't think it's fundamentally different from building learners' capacity to learn effectively. So I don't think we should privilege it in a special way. We're labelling it and identifying it as a particular practice because there are things that we do right now in our courses that don't work. You know? That they are there because we believe that by providing useful information to students it will help them in their learning, and we've got huge amounts of evidence to suggest that it doesn't work, and it can't work if they don't read it, if they don't access it, and so on and so forth. So we know that a lot of students don't access it. So this is a pointer to say, of this bigger realm of learning how to learn, this is a bit where we need to focus our particular attention. Can I just go back briefly to the online context? You were referring to, in a sense, the more sophisticated boundaries of feedback literacy online. I think the core things that David and myself and Liz were talking about earlier are absolutely 100% identical in online. The ways you do it and the devices you use clearly vary for the appropriateness of the online environment. But there's nothing in our frameworks that say, well, because it's online, we've got to do this, but this bit doesn't apply. From our framework, the whole thing applies. And there may be the additional things that you've identified as well.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to throw over to a question from the room.
Or challenge.
Yeah, something that's not working for you. All right, I think Rolla had her hand up first.
I was reflecting on what you were saying, and I had an example from something we did in our master's program of medical education, where we developed a feedback journal, and part of every assignment we asked students to tell us what aspect of their work they wanted feedback on. So we prompted them to seek feedback, and I was reflecting that some students used it really well, and often it was about bridging coursework to what they did in the workplace, because these were doctors for the most part. But others really hadn't, either were using it very instrumentally or had no idea, so they would say things like all of it or any of it. And these are postgrad students, and and we were thinking of even going down the line of having exemplars for how you might go about answering a question like that. And it just, it's just this kind of ever mushrooming thing that you can kind of go down rabbit holes in. But it just struck me that even in the postgrad space, we really need to do a lot of scaffolding for this thing that we called feedback seeking.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nods from the panel, that idea of the need to scaffold when you're doing something even slightly unusual. I wonder if anyone would like to talk to that sort of, it's almost a need for change management there.
Yeah, or I can stick a question at
the end. Yeah, chuck a question at the end.
And it comes back to this thing we were discussing, Naomi, about the Matthew effect. Are the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, i.e. those who can self-regulate and who are feedback literate are the ones who will benefit ultimately, and how do we scaffold those who are underperforming?
Yeah, this reference to the Matthew effect is a term that I think is most commonly used in the literature on children's reading development, and it refers to an idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which is a passage in St Matthew's Gospel, which is why it's called the Matthew effect. And I think it's something we need to be very aware of when we're looking at perhaps being very well-meaning in putting in place opportunities for students to develop particular skills or capacities, that there are some students who, by nature of their prior learning, through perhaps some of their individual characteristics, will gain more from those interventions than others. And there are others who perhaps would benefit the most from them, who don't necessarily, at the present time, have the capacity to really be able to access and benefit from those interventions. One of the things I think this represents, again, is the importance of not making any assumptions, ensuring that what we're doing is as inclusive as possible, because otherwise we might find that we are privileging some students over others in the kinds of interventions that we're developing. And I think there's something here in what you're saying, Rola, about there's almost a need for a baseline level of feedback literacy before you can further develop your feedback literacy through engagement with some of these interventions.
Who goes?
Anna, go for it.
Yeah. So I think it, at least in my opinion, it takes us back to the point when we measure those things, right? Wouldn't it be great to say, you know, this person is lacking this skill, this person is lacking that skill, so let me help you. And that would make us deliver differential feedback. Because when I work, for example, when I teach my PhD seminars, and I have 7 students in my class, I know exactly who responds how to my feedback comments, who needs more comments, who needs, you know, a little bit less, what kind, praise, you know, negative feedback. But when I teach an undergraduate class and I have 50 students, it's already becoming harder to do that, right? So in that case, it would be very useful to kind of have a clear operational definition, clear measurement. And I know I sound like a broken record, but I think in the end, it all boils down to that. So if we want to develop interventions, if we want to help specific students, I think we have no other choice but come up with a way of identifying those students. And if we're not teaching a 7-person PhD class, the only way we can do it is by developing strong assessment measures, be it situational judgment tests or really high-quality self-reports, and kind of at least getting an idea of where each student is.
I think Liz was next.
Yeah, just in response to that, I think we need to research this relationship between general competence and capability and feedback literacy. And if I look at our medical cohort, high selection bar, they tend to be very capable, and I suspect they would be quite feedback literate because they've read their world, they pick up on cues, and they're organised. It's not just IQ related. But I think there's people that are poorly performing may have blind spots about their own performance, and therefore they don't know how to ask for certain aspects of feedback on certain aspects of their work. But there's another issue that I think we haven't addressed so far this afternoon, and that is about the risk that we're asking learners to take. So if you're poorly performing and you know that you're skating on thin ice, there is reason for me to put my best shiny self forward and to say, do you mind commenting on these good aspects of my performance? For me to raise my deficits and what I'm really struggling with, for Dave, who's providing me with a summative mark as well as some formative feedback, takes a huge amount of risk. And I do think that that's a hard ask on learners, and it probably doesn't serve them well. So I'd like to think more about this vulnerability and this risk relationship around feedback literacy.
Yeah, before I hand over to David, Juso Nieminen from the stream has said, what's the role of marks and grades and all of this in feedback literacy? And I wonder if you might be able to weave that in.
I think Rola's intervention speaks to a big challenge we face in terms of modularisation and discontinuity of continuity of staff. I'd like to give a concrete example. I think there's a danger with these nice strategies, if they're one-off, that they don't really have the impact. And Tony Harland and colleagues in the University of Otago they co-developed an ecology program, and they embedded peer feedback, peer review within each year of the program. So I think this enables it to be scaffolded, supported, iterative, and developmentally and cumulatively sort of building on each previous experience. And I think in the literature there's too much sort of one-off studies of peer feedback, peer assessment, and I think their research that had different stages. So in the first year, the students were kind of trained and coached in doing peer review, and they saw the value of composing peer review comments, that it's not just what you receive, but composing comments is cognitively rich, and it forces you to diagnose the strengths and weaknesses and make suggestions for improvement. Then they built on that in year 2, and they went through a peer review process analogous to what we do when we submit to journals. So they got 3 anonymous reviews, and then they had to compose a response in which they stated which comments they followed through with, which ones they weren't going to follow through with, and why. So it was called peer review plus rebuttal. So it was a 3-year program where in each year they are doing a rich peer feedback experience, and I think we need more of that kind of thing. So with the interactive cover sheet idea that Rola was talking about, if it was prepared in one unit and then followed up in another unit and at increasingly sophisticated levels, I think there would be more opportunity for students to get their heads around it and to work out what it is that, where is the value in it. Well, I've got the floor. Can I just try on the grading?
Go for it.
I did a study recently where I interviewed a small sample of students, but over the whole duration of their program, which in Hong Kong was a 5-year program. So I interviewed these students over 5 years. And one of the things they always came back to was that any feedback after the grade is awarded is of relatively little use to them. They want the comments while the course is still live so that they can work with the feedback so that they can improve the grade. The grade is the great currency in their existence. The grade is what they want and they need. So it seems to me that we can actually have less commentary at the end of the unit and correspondingly more support or guidance during the process. So it seems to me the grade issue can really get us to focus the commentary where it can support them, and once it's all over, less. So that's less workload for some of us, I hope.
I think Dave.
Yeah. One of the things that we need to avoid doing is to kind of conflate feedback events and assessment grading events, that they don't necessarily go together. We've developed this bad habit that we only do feedback things in conjunction with a graded event, and that has kind of pushed these two together and create problems for ourselves. So we know that if you have a piece of paper in which there's a grade and some very useful information for the student will go immediately to the grade, and many of them will not even bother reading the useful information. So if the grade is within their acceptable range of, yeah, that's fair enough, they might not go on and read the rest. So I think we need to be very careful about the power of grades to displace a whole lot of the good things we want to do on learning. So grades are a kind of way of short-circuiting and undermining learning processes. And there are 2 issues with the grades. One, the grade is not meaningful, so they're a coded representation to students of something that they can't decode. So we encrypt information in a grade in a way that students can't unencrypt it. So maybe we need to focus more on when we are using grades, it is actually much, much clearer about what is being represented by that. And the use of rubrics is a way of actually started to move down that path. So that's the clarity of grades. And I also endorse the kind of David's point about where feedback information is needed. Feedback information is always needed in the process of formation. So if we want to redeploy our time much more effectively, stop doing it on the final assignment when students are moving on to another unit, and redeploy that at an earlier stage when students can think and focus. I had a colleague at UTS in journalism that only gave feedback information during the first 4 weeks of the semester. And this had a very, very powerful effect on our students. It actually transformed the way the students were learning. And they knew they were not going to get anything later. So they really took a lot of emphasis, a lot of focus on that. And then they could utilise it afterwards.
Thanks, Anna.
And this is the point when our landscapes very much overlap, because in my quantitative work, I've conducted a share of studies, and I investigated the effects of grades in different subjects and with different populations, and all we find is that when you present a grade and some kind of commentary, students typically ignore the commentary. And there are so many instances of anecdotal evidence in my classes, which I'll spare you from those. But it's, I work in the US. There is an elite prep school that decided to drop grading altogether. So I worked with that school, and students are not graded for the first 2 years of their schooling. And negative effect went down, so depression, anxiety, and stress is much lower. Students are learning, the learning progress compared to previous years with the same material. Learning is more enjoyable. Students report, the reports of well-being are much higher, and yeah, the outcomes are excellent. So grades, I don't want to say that grade is inherently terrible, but in the process, if you have that instance of, for example, writing, revising, and resubmitting, presenting a student with this intermediate grade is never a good idea. And then in the field of pedagogy and grading, there is a conversation about differentiated grading, because in the end, grade is this combination of everything. So it's your dispositions, it's how frequently you are late to class. It's also, if you look at syllabi, it's unbelievable what goes into that grade. So maybe we could think as a field, maybe it would be a good idea to move towards differentiated grading and have some processes graded separately from your performance on certain tasks.
Thanks. I've got a bit of a curly question that I'd like to ask. So I'm going to target this one at you, Liz. You get the curly one. So we've talked about how feedback practices are often not that great, and you've talked about feedback literacy in the university and in the workplace. Isn't there a concern that as we shift the focus onto feedback literacy, we shift the problem of feedback into being a deficit in the student, rather than some of the abominable things that we do to students and to employees?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and it's a comment I've heard before about the shifting the blame. I mean, I see it from another viewpoint. I see when teachers feel that their sole responsibility is to curate and deliver a message, I think it puts a huge burden on the teacher to get it right and to make it stick through that transmission. And then when it doesn't stick, and we know that often we don't see that transference into action, what happens is the teacher will blame the student for the lack of translation. So I think there's much more blame of the student with the transmissive model of feedback than what we're proposing here, where we're saying there is mutual responsibility, and in fact teachers have a responsibility about how to scaffold learners to come into this dialogue and to make sense and use the information. So I see it in the reverse way, that we're arguing for a shared responsibility, and that it doesn't mean that we dust off think our job is done, but actually we need to work just as hard but work in a different way to try to build these capabilities for the learners to participate.
Thank you. I'd like to give the opportunity for someone in the room to ask a question. Yeah, Paige.
I'm doing some work around collaboration, and one of the things that happens in collaboration is a lot of peer feedback. And in speaking with a couple of students recently, there's a lot of bias in that feedback. How would you address that for feedback literacy and taking that away and upskilling students to actually do that?
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, just to use a very tangible example around how we teach our medical students about peer feedback, I think that's part of literacy, to understand that as people move through the world, they see the world in certain ways. And if you're an educational psychologist with quant methods, you will see the problem in this way and someone else will see it in another way. So I'm not so concerned about getting rid of bias. I'm more concerned, I think part of feedback literacy is to acknowledge that humans have different worldviews, and let's see where people are coming from. And in fact, very disparate views on the same problem can be very informative in building a picture about work or quality of performance. Yeah.
Can I pick that one also? I did some work with a colleague here, who's no longer at Deakin now, about peer feedback and peer assessment in the context of kind of group assignments, and whether there was a difference in terms of whether the grades counted or not. And one of the things that came out really, really strongly was if you have the perverse incentive of grading for real, then students massively distort the judgments and the information they provide to each other. When you don't have that distraction and distortion through grades, then the students were quite reasonable at providing useful information to each other. So one of the things I conclude from that is that, one, we shouldn't be grading these things, but more importantly, we need to look at the conditions under which this peer feedback exchange is occurring. And are there things which we inadvertently have built in to the procedure that create distractions from students for telling it how it is?
Yeah, David.
I very much wish that my submissions to journals didn't suffer from peer reviewer bias. In the Carlis and Bow 2018 paper, we talk about modelling. In other words, the teacher sharing their experience of receiving peer review or student evaluations of teaching, and actually maybe showing students some harsh comments or some comments of different kinds. And then also we have that issue of reviewer 1 and reviewer 2 sometimes have a completely different take on the paper. Because sometimes in peer feedback processes, students seem to get quite upset when they get contradictory evidence. So to me, this is all part of the real world. For academics, for students in the workplace, you often get conflicting peer review comments or conflicting peer feedback. And I think we have to talk it through with the students. And I think the students find this quite real and quite sort of us opening up to them, which I think colleagues call intellectual candor or intellectual streaking, you know, laying yourself bare and saying to the students, well, I once received this comment from a student about my teaching, I've received this comment. I think that's the real world, and I think actually they appreciate being exposed to how peer review works in academia and in the workplace.
Just to make a comment, and Joe Tyre did a PhD looking at the role of peer feedback and peer learning, and one thing I think students are terrified of, and it might be related to bias, is this notion of the blind leading the blind. And you know, I don't want to suffer from someone's ignorance in terms of providing commentary on my performance. So that is one thing. And I think the other thing that students are also worried about is if the peer feedback replaces the expert feedback, and then they necessarily see it as the poor cousin. So I think if we present this as peer feedback is another data point that might be informative in you building a picture about your performance, it's quite different from saying you won't get the expert fill, but you'll get a peer instead.
So one other concern that I want to throw to the panel, I feel like I get to ask these curly ones. Feedback already occupies so much of academics' working lives. It's a huge use of time. I was at one university where the calculation was done that marking and feedback was 40% of the teaching and learning budget. 40%. So you can imagine the many, many millions that were spent on it. Is this whole feedback literacy thing something that is for small classes, for large classes? Can it scale? Who wants to take up the tricky question?
David's looking at me, so... Okay, can it scale? Yes, absolutely. I think when we're faced with a challenge in education, it encourages us to think creatively and to develop new ways of doing things. If things were easy and simple all the time, we'd just end up doing the same things over and over again. The workload issue is a massive issue, and it's, I think, the biggest fear that the educators we might work with will experience. They will think, I can't possibly do this, I have no more time. Assessment and feedback already takes up too much of my time. I can't possibly do any more. I think Dave has alluded to the really important message that this isn't about doing more. In fact, in many cases, it might be about doing less, but it's just doing that at a time where it's likely to have an impact, rather than essentially wasting time on providing what then becomes an artefact. It becomes grade justification. Comments right at the end of a unit. We can say, look, feedback has happened because we gave students an assessment, we've given them a grade, and we've written some comments to go along with it. And that really doesn't function as feedback. So I think the first part of the question is that, yes, workload is a challenge, but it doesn't need to be. We just need to think about feedback as something that is not necessarily part of the assessment process. As Dave said, they're uneasy bedfellows in some way, yet we always put assessment and feedback together. And maybe we need to think about feedback as something that's much more organic and ongoing, rather than this event that happens when work has been completed. In terms of scaling, again, we just need to think creatively about how we might do that. Now, one example that I can give in very concrete terms is a colleague of mine at the University of Surrey who wanted to develop a way of giving exam feedback to a large cohort of students, several hundred students. And students are able to request to go and sit with the academic and look at their exam paper if they want to. Now, if all the students chose to do that, that would just be completely unmanageable. So what she did was decided to give a 1-hour webinar after the exams have been marked. She would start the webinar by talking through the questions, what was done well, where students perhaps slipped up, some common misconceptions, how the exam technique could have been improved. And just like we've got on the live stream here today, the whole time the students were submitting questions to her about the feedback, about the exam, about how to improve. What I think is really nice about that is that you can do that with several hundred people at once, and also no student is excluded from the advice the teacher is giving to any one student. They all see everything. So I think we just need to think creatively about how to do that at scale.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Dylan William quote. It's something like, feedback should be more work for the recipient than it is for the donor. And that's a great example of shifting that sort of workload around. Do I see Dave, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, we have no evidence whatsoever to suggest that in order to give much better feedback processes, we need to spend more time and effort. There's a whole lot of indicators in terms of good feedback processes that are well documented, that will enable us to reduce some of our time, and that means reducing it in places where it has very, very little effect, like at the end of semester, and actually redeploying that. But also redeploying our activities from, for example, written comments on students' work to audio or video comments or screencast comments. So some of these things are completely scalable. So one of the things we did in the OLT project I mentioned earlier was that we created a whole lot of resources from case studies that have been identified by students as being really excellent feedback practices. And many of those are huge first-year units, well over 1,000 students in these units. And they could show that people were directing their feedback energies in a different way within a budget in order to kind of produce really great effects. And I mean, feedbackforlearning.org if you want to follow up on those case studies.
We have a question in the room here. You have a microphone behind you.
Thanks, Dave. I feel like we're sort of starting to talk a little bit around maybe being efficient as teachers and as educators. And I guess in the spirit of that efficiency, and thinking about Dave's comment earlier that feedback literacy is merely a subset of learning how to learn, are there other subsets that you would see as being really essential for working with feedback literacy development, or perhaps working against it? I guess I'm just wondering, is there anything else we should be trying to design for, or anything else we should be trying to develop alongside feedback literacy that would really help? I'm thinking in particular about those students at risk of underperformance and students who don't want to expose themselves, because I feel like they're the ones who maybe need development across the board in different areas in order to prepare themselves to learn how to learn. It might be sort of outside the scope of today, but I guess I'm thinking about that relationship between feedback literacy development and sort of what else is going on for the learners as they're sort of figuring things out for themselves.
We have thoughtful faces. We haven't had anyone jump in. Yeah, Dave.
I mean, I'm not a mug to jump in on this. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to think about is I mean, you could wrap it up in the eliciting feedback kind of category, but there's something which precedes that, which goes before, that when we treat students very passively and we position them in our, especially our first year classes, as just being receivers, we are inadvertently biasing ourselves towards students that already have certain capabilities. So that when there are the very, very few opportunities for them to express themselves and request things, the people that jump into that space are the people that have already well developed those capacities. So that we are selling short all the other students that actually need practice in doing that. So one of the fundamental things I think we need to think about is mobilising students to be active. I don't know how we describe that in various ways. It's kind of will be represented a different way in different courses, but the practice of doing things very early on and getting students to express themselves and to articulate what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're knowing, is something that is going to touch a much wider range of students. So that, yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about the work of Ryan Bridges, who's a medical educator at the University of Toronto, and he does quite a bit of research and pedagogy around productive failure. So this idea of setting up, for example, simulated learning tasks for learners where they necessarily have to fail, and then they get feedback on that performance and they get to experiment how to use that feedback in the next task attempt. So there's something about, I suppose, training for those processes that I think is important, and I think by setting up, having the control to set up the subsequent task means that learners can start to experience the proof is in the pudding. So it's almost like a feed-forward cycle, and perhaps breed some of that confidence that Naomi was talking about that might be part of feedback literacy.
I think so. I think if we don't provide the opportunities for students to find these things challenging, they're not going to really develop the kinds of capacities that will be transferable, long-lasting, and feedback is necessarily something very, very difficult to grapple with. We've alluded to the fact that it's often contradictory from different sources, that it often evokes very strong emotional responses, that we may be more focused on pure evaluation of a grade rather than the comments. These are all challenges that we go through when dealing with feedback information, and I deliberately mean everybody does. It's not something that's unique to students, and we just need to give students the opportunity to experience those challenges and for us to share our challenges too, to really normalise this process, and that's where I think we'll start to see the transformative learning in feedback literacy.
But I think at the same time we need to create episodes in which students can be successful. And I think there is such a thing, I'm introducing a new term, feedback self-efficacy. So we need to create an episode, and it's on record, I'm live, right? So there is typical educational interventions, right? If you have a student who's constantly failing, one of the approaches of helping the students is to create a situation in which the student will succeed, because we know that self-efficacy builds on prior performance, and we need to create these smaller units. And I always think about it with PhD students who often struggle and are trying to, so I'm given this really easy, manageable task. They succeed, okay, so we got somewhere, and then we're getting to a bigger task. So I think with feedback as well, so we should create an episode in which students are allowed or scaffolded enough to successfully use that feedback, so that in the future they'll be, they'll have more self-efficacy, and we'll have a higher chance of using feedback effectively. And then another construct that relates to feedback literacy, it's actually part of feedback literacy, the whole emotion management. For a long time now, I explicitly talk to my students about coping. Okay, so there is this trichotomy of coping strategies. We have our avoidant coping, we have problem-focused coping, and emotion-focused coping. So when you get a bad mark, or when you get comments that you do not like, there are different approaches that you can take in coping with that situation. And my colleague Jeff Smith and I, we talk about Kubler-Ross and stages of dealing with death. It's very similar to when you get a low grade, because you're in denial, then you are bargaining, then you are mad, right? You're angry at the instructor, all that. So you have to work through that. So you go through emotion coping, and then maybe you could choose to avoid. So you put it aside, like when you get those reviewer 2 comments, you're like, I can take it, or I'll look at it later. So you avoid, but then you problem solve. So I always make it very explicit to my students, and it's been, I'm not the one who came up with this idea. So it's a very effective intervention. Make it very explicit and tell them, so here are the 3 typical ways in which you can cope with, for example, feedback that you do not like, and this is the most effective. There is tons of evidence, tons of research evidence that shows that problem-based coping is really effective, so you need to design a plan and actually do something. But before that, it's okay for you to be kind of upset and angry and all that, and you can avoid and not look at it for some time, but then always come back to problem solving. So that would be a related construct to feedback literacy for sure.
Thank you. And thank you for feedback self-efficacy bracket Lipovich 2019. I'm going to use that. So, and here we're just going to go deeply personal. I do improv comedy, as some of you know. You wouldn't guess it from the success rate of any laughs on this. But see, the anti-joke is always more powerful than the joke. So I have high feedback self-efficacy. I think I deal with it pretty well at work. I have some strategies. I've written up some of my strategies. So other people have said, wow, that's some good feedback strategies. I think I'm quite good. And then in improv comedy, yeah, that gets laughs. That wasn't meant to get laughs. And then I'm at improv and I'm doing something and my coach says, hey, Phil, looks like you've made a really hard choice there. How about you try this other thing? And I say, no, my way's working. Let me try it. And I get all worked up and all stressed out. So my question is, to what extent is this really tied to a domain or a type of practice? To what extent is all of this universal?
May I? I think in education in general, and here I would like to cite Dylan Williams, he says that our question should be not what works, but what works and under which circumstances and with what audiences. So we need to go as specific as we can, because in education in general, there is a myriad of variables working at the same time in any context, and it's really hard to generalize. There are, of course, certain trends, and in terms of feedback, we are finding that there is for example, characteristic receptivity to feedback that makes you more receptive to feedback in general, but it will vary dramatically from context to context. Maybe improv comedy is really important for your attainment value, right, for your self-image. That's why you are more sensitive about receiving feedback comments, whereas when you go, I don't know, dancing, you don't care as much about the feedback that
I care a lot about feedback when I'm dancing. Don't ever give me feedback when I'm dancing. It will be much more poorly handled. Look, we are at time, so I'd just like to thank our panel. It's been a wonderful panel session. Thank you. And thank you all for attending, for some great questions, and to everybody on the stream. If you were on the stream and you want to keep the conversation going on Twitter, that would be fantastic. Our hashtag is #CradleDeacon. So thanks. Goodbye.